Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in February of 1906 in Breslau, Prussia. In 1943, he was executed by the Nazis in Flossenburg, Germany. Why? Why did this happen to him? And why is he now considered a martyr, a prominent Christian theologian of the 20th century, perhaps a saint? I would like to briefly introduce Bonhoeffer's life and work to you. Consider his legacy for today before you discuss in groups a reading from his discipleship. Bonhoeffer was the second youngest of a privileged family in Breslau, Germany, which is now a city in Poland. He had 7 siblings. His hometown went in the 1932 elections to the Nazi Party by 44% of the vote. The third highest number of any election in Germany at that time. At a young age, Bonhoeffer decided to become a theologian. He loved to play church as a child. Later, he was fascinated by reading theology. His decision to study theology was perhaps crystallized when his brother Walter died in the waning years of World War I. When he announced his decision, his older brothers mocked him, saying that no one could imagine a more paltry institution than the church. Bonhoeffer replied at 15 years old, "In that case, I shall reform it." Bonhoeffer was a voracious student. He finished his doctorate of theology in Berlin at 21 years of age, which is embarrassing for those of us who took longer. His teachers in Berlin, the theology faculty there, tended to be Protestant liberals. And this was maybe one of the strongholds of liberal Protestant thought. And they despised the audacious new work of Karl Barth, who was trying to revive Orthodox theology in the 20th century. And Bonhoeffer tried to find a middle ground between these two influences. He was both appealing to his professors and what they were teaching him, but he was also influenced by the work of Barth. His early work, and perhaps all of his work in his life, asked the question, where in the reality of the world does the new life confessed by Christians become real? And in that rather dense sentence is a focus on Christians in community and their concrete relationships and how that sort of incarnates the church. However, at this early stage, Bonhoeffer had not yet rejected the nationalism of his teachers. In some of his early writings, he thought that self-defense of war was allowed and Christians were called to obey and defend their nations, not the impractical commands of Jesus' Beatitudes. Bonhoeffer was also a pastor. The year after graduating, he started preaching. His first sermon was to German expats in Barcelona, Spain, and he focused on a text from Romans. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace would no longer be grace. This was a famous passage for Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. And he was already at work with the theology of Martin Luther, in whose tradition he stood. And he had a passion for redemption and the new creation through God. He was trying to merge that with the idea of justification by grace alone. Bonhoeffer argued that we are not simply a passive vessel filled by grace. He says, grace frees and forms, invites and involves us, changes and transforms the Christian. Doesn't just sort of pile snow on top of them, like in Luther's famous image of a dunghill covered by snow. In 1930, Bonhoeffer set sail for America to take up a fellowship at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He found his classmates and teachers bewildering. He told a colleague back home that students were completely clueless, ignorant of Christian thought, and intoxicated with liberal and humanistic phrases. He asked one professor, Reinhold Niebuhr, Obama's favorite theologian, whether this was a theological school or a school for politicians. Pretty damning. However, Without being in America, Bonhoeffer would not have encountered one of the most important influences on his later thought, Black Protestant Christianity. At Union, one of the Black seminarians invited him to a church service in Harlem. Bonhoeffer was astonished by the exuberant and serious worship he saw there, and he was deeply saddened by seeing the real face of America and its treatment of African Americans. He scoured record shops for recordings and Black gospel music, which would be the devotional soundtrack for the rest of his life in Germany. And he would teach his seminarians in Flossenburg to appreciate Black music. And then when he took a 7-week road trip through the south of the States, he nodded these brief notes to his supervisor, mentioning things like blood laws, mob rule, sterilizations, and the repugnant racism of the white pastors he saw. Now, after this fellowship in the States, when he returned to Germany, he would clash with his mentor, Karl Barth. Barth famously argued against Bonhoeffer that Christian theology bore no responsibility to change society. Bonhoeffer, in contrast, started preaching, lecturing, and teaching Sunday school again just in time for Hitler to come to power. The Protestants who called themselves the Deutsch Christian were swearing loyalty to the German Volk, which they thought of as a new Israel chosen by God to replace the Jews. They wanted a strong, muscular, manly church to complete Martin Luther's work and be fully unified on ethnic grounds. Within weeks of Hitler's rise to power, Bonhoeffer immediately began criticizing him. He delivered a public radio broadcast that warned Germans that everyone who misappropriates the eternal law and concedes responsibility to a Superman will in the end be destroyed by him. His radio address was cut off live after about 10 minutes. Soon after this, the German Lutheran Church elected Nazi leaders. Most of the theology students and faculty in Berlin were self-declared Nazis, and thousands rallied to demand the removal of the Old Testament from the Bible. Bonhoeffer, in contrast, published an essay called The Church and the Jewish Question, where he condemned the new legislation that excluded Jews from all professions, including the church. He called on the church to question the state, to assist victims, even if they were not Christian, and to take direct action to resist. From this, Bonhoeffer quickly became a leader in the emerging confessing church, this portion of German pastors who rejected the Deutsch Christian and were trying to preserve a non-Nazi form of Christianity. In 1933, Bonhoeffer accepted an appointment as a pastor of German-speaking churches in London. While he was there, he tried to drum up support for the resistance, but Karl Barth called him a coward for leaving Germany. After about 2 years, Barth then fled to Switzerland, while Bonhoeffer returned to Germany to found the Emergency Pastor Seminary at Finkenwald. He started training 23 confessing church pastors there. At this underground seminary, Bonhoeffer introduced his students to a radical curriculum that included monastic practices, which were not in vogue. So they had them do daily prayer, silent meditation, Bible study, singing, and lectio divina before they could listen to lectures and do assignments. His students hated it, and Bonhoeffer had to keep adjusting the disciplines, although they never quite got comfortable with it. Many of his lectures at this underground seminary were incorporated into the book Discipleship, which was the first chapter of which was your reading tonight. This experiment in resistance ended in 1937, when the Gestapo closed the seminary and arrested many of the students. Bonhoeffer spent the next 2 years traveling in secret around Germany, trying to support the confessing church, which was in hiding. He was invited to return to New York by his friends in the States, but as soon as he got there, he regretted leaving Germany, and then he returned against their protests. He wrote, Christians in Germany will have to face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that a future Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization and any true Christianity. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice from a place of security. On his return, Bonhoeffer was barred from speaking or publishing anything. His previous books were considered subversive by the Nazi censor. However, his brother-in-law, Hans Donanier, was a leader in the German resistance and worked in the Abwehr, a German military intelligence. Donanier brought Bonhoeffer into the Abwehr to protect him from being conscripted and to hopefully use him to establish contact with the Allies. So Bonhoeffer did this work sort of as a courier to various English contacts, including his ecumenical contacts in England, who basically ignored him and he never made any contact with the Allies. But during this time, he reflected on the apathy of his fellow Germans. He was surprised that there was more humanists and atheists than Christians in the resistance. And this led him to perhaps revise some of the stark dualism that you'll see in discipleship. At the same time, Bonhoeffer was deeply aware that the high-born humanism of the upper classes in Germany was just as complicit in the evil of Nazism. He said that all the cultured elites set for success in life now seem to be soulless, obsequious lackeys, brooding in tired indifference. In Bonhoeffer's book, Ethics, written while he worked for the Abwehr, he ponders whether extreme actions might be required of morally responsible people in extraordinary circumstances and exceptional cases. This absolutely, without question, reflected his own awareness of the plots against Hitler, including the assassination attempt that involved a time bomb on a plane. Bonhoeffer still taught pacifism, as he had for most of the previous decade, but he also gives his blessing implicit to those who conspired to murder the Führer. He did not deny that there was a contradiction here. It seems from what he said that he was willing to incur the guilt of breaking one of God's commandments given the extraordinary situation. So not to justify it, but to accept the guilt because it was necessary. In 1943, after this final assassination plot, Bonhoeffer was arrested. He was imprisoned for 1.5 years. During this time, he spoke to his fellow prisoners and the guards about faith. He conducted Sunday services, and he carried on a correspondence through messages smuggled through the guards and through his fiancée, Maria. He was executed in April 1943, 1 month before Germany surrendered to the Allies. He was executed because Hitler read the diary of the Abwehr head, Admiral Canaris, and ordered the execution of all the remaining prisoners from military intelligence. As Bonhoeffer was led away to be hanged, he told an English prisoner, "This is the end, but for me, it is the beginning of life." So Bonhoeffer is obviously a hero figure, and this has led to a lot of interest in him over the years. I'm relying heavily on a book I can recommend. This is Strange Glory, A Life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer by Charles Marsh. I'll leave it out on the table. So this is the most recent and I think the best biography of Bonhoeffer. Because of his extraordinary life, alongside the fact that he was a theologian, a lot of people have tried to claim Bonhoeffer as their own. Initially, I think in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of interest in some cryptic comments Bonhoeffer made about Christianity beyond religion, or religionless Christianity. He never had a chance to fully develop these ideas because he was killed. But some liberals thought, oh, this means he's one of us. More recently, Eric Metaxas has written a biography of Bonhoeffer, which is terrible. And it attempts to make Bonhoeffer an evangelical fundamentalist who is motivated to do the things he is because of his disgust with the liberalism of his professors. But what's really going on, I think, and what Marsh's biography and more recent scholarship highlights, is that Bonhoeffer is reacting against the pervasive Christian nationalism of the Nazis and of their Deutsch Christian supporters, right? Yes, while we're fighting about whether he was a liberal or a conservative, he is concerned with fascism and the Holocaust and the way that this has been built on German Christianity's support for the nation state. That brings me to, I think, one of the questions I had when I was reading about Bonhoeffer, the multiple times I've come back to his work. I think there's a temptation when we see what he did with his life and his martyrdom to ask, well, what's the key here? What's the insight, the secret, the profound wisdom that he came to and wrote down that inspired him to do the extraordinary things he did? And if we could only find that, then perhaps it would inspire us to do extraordinary things. But I'm not sure that's how that works. I think his relationships, his experiences, especially in the States, his friendships, led him to a life that was committed to Jesus in a way that was different than those around him. And then his writing was an attempt to understand that. So that we can benefit from reading his writing and from learning about him. But I think it would be a mistake to think that there's some sort of like secret sauce we can distill out of his books that will just solve our problems today. More people should read Bonhoeffer and know about Bonhoeffer, but he lived his life. We have to now decide how to live ours.